Well, for more from the United States, we cross to Sherwin Bryce-Peace. He's live from New York. Sherwin, it's good morning to you over in the States. Protests have spiraled out of control, worse than they did in August when Brown was shot. What's the latest?
Well, Natasha, it's finally calm out there, but that certainly was not the case a few hours ago. After crowds gathered all day peacefully outside police stations, municipal buildings, and the courthouse where this decision not to indict Officer Darren Wilson was made, pandemonium, and that's really the only way to describe it, broke out. Gunfire was heard, volleys of tear gas fired to disperse what can only be described as an angry crowd, but also, quite frankly, with some lawless elements or agitators who, when they dispersed, went to different store locations, breaking storefront windows, accessing those stores through the smashed glass or doors, and looting with gay abandon, it could be said, including, as you mentioned in that piece, including the liquor store. We understand the same store where Michael Brown is said to have allegedly stolen cigarillos before his confrontation with Officer Darren Brown. That very store was looted, several buildings set on fire, several police cars destroyed. It's fair to say it was a mess out there last night, and still more questions than answers this morning. But I will say this, seeing people run into stores and looting them, setting buildings on fire and so forth, has shifted the conversation somewhat away from the decision of the grand jury, away from the anguish of the Brown family, who called for peaceful protests, and onto looting, things of rampage, what some are calling the inadequate response of local law enforcement, and a country, Natasha, that yesterday was hoping this wouldn't happen, but did.
All right, so Sherwin, you touch on interesting points there. What we're seeing here, the protest, the looting, a community being torn apart. Is it fair to say deep racial tensions still plaguing the U.S.? I know President Obama touched on it briefly, but take us through that.
Certainly. I mean, many in Ferguson and in places around the United States will argue that this was not what broke the camel's back. This was not a fabric of society destroyed by what happened in Ferguson last night, but by the shooting of an unarmed black teenager over 3 months ago by a white police officer who will not face charges, by law enforcement that targets young black men who often get killed as a result. And that's a story that happens often in this country. I think what President Obama said at the White House immediately after the decision was announced was that as much as many people will disagree with the grand jury ruling, we are still a nation of laws. I think you had that in the piece. He says, quote, hurting others and destroying property is not the answer no matter what the grand jury decides. But he also admitted, Natasha, that the situation in Ferguson spoke to the broader challenges in society, particularly the deep distrust between communities of color and the police, saying this was as a result of the legacy of racial discrimination in this country. There is, of course, still that federal civil rights investigation underway into the Ferguson Police Department, which is being conducted by the Justice Department under Attorney General Eric Holder. And that is a completely separate case from the one presented to the grand jury. So certainly this is a story about race that will be reinforced by the decision last night and the images that emerge from that decision. It will reinforce old stereotypes in both instances, and that's an additional tragedy in all of this.
All right, Sherwin, thank you very much. We will continue to track that story throughout the day, and I'm sure talk to you again at some stage.